Philippians chapter 1, verse 6 says this, "And I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ." If you didn't know, I've been a little bit sick. I'm going to try to make it through, but I also know I may only have so many words this morning. But what I do want you to know is I understand my life is messy and your life is messy. And Philippians 1 there gives us a great hope that the one who began a good work in you will see it to completion. And some of you may be wondering, why do we study through a book like Genesis? And we're in Genesis chapter 20 and 21. And we've been looking at the life of Abraham. And here's the reason it is worth examining Abraham's life, is because it's like looking into a mirror. When I see Abraham's faults, I see my own faults. When I see his sins, I see my own sins. But also, when I see God's faithfulness in Abraham's life, I see God's faithfulness in my own life. Now remember, Abram, who became Abraham, was called out by God to go leave your homeland to the promised land, the land of Canaan, and that you will have a great nation, and nations come from you. And we have been examining Abram and then Abraham's life for some time. And yes, he's supposed to have this great nation, but he has a great problem throughout this whole equation. You can't have nations when you don't have any offspring. And so Abraham has no son. And we've seen Abraham try to make his own way from time to time with Ishmael. And God blessed that, but God did not use that. That was not God's plan. That was Sarai's plan and Abram's plan. And so God went on with his own plan. I say that to say this. In your own life, maybe a proverb that is important to me, that may be important to you, is many are the plans of man, but the Lord directs his paths. Abraham makes a lot of plans, but the Lord ultimately is the one who is directing his paths. And in your own life, you may make lots of plans, but it is God who is sovereignly working for his good pleasures. We're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 20 and 21. I'm not going to read it all just in this moment, but I want to lay it out for you. In chapter 20, you can divide essentially in three parts. You're looking at Abimelech. Now, Abimelech, the first section here, Abimelech is rebuked by God. In the second section, Abimelech rebukes Abraham. And then in the third section, Abraham blesses Abimelech. And so we're going to see the significance of this because it is a part of God keeping his promise. If you'll remember in the covenant, part of the covenant to Abraham is that the nations who bless you will be blessed, and the nations that curse you will be cursed. And with Abimelech, we see because Abimelech blesses Abraham, he is blessed by Abraham. So let's read Genesis 20, beginning in verse 1. From there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of Negeb and lived between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, "She is my sister." And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife." Now Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, "Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, 'She is my sister'?" And she herself said, "He is my brother." In the integrity of my heart and in the innocence of my hands, I have done this. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return her, now that you shall surely die, and all who are yours. As we look at that passage, it sounds a little bit familiar because we've read a familiar or a similar story earlier where Abraham does the same thing. But notice just a few things about this. Abraham is a man of faith, and yet he's still not showing great faithfulness. He's not a perfect man. I have to be honest, I like things to be perfect. I think most people do. I don't want problems to occur, but I've never gone a day that was perfect. I've never gone very long that everything just happened exactly as it was supposed to. Life is messy. Pastoring, you learn that life is messy. Some of the godliest people can be in some messy situations. Just as a family member, you recognize life is messy. In your own life, you recognize this. Life is just messy. There's good, but there's also bad. There's easy, but there's also hard. And so here, Abraham, he's not a perfect man. He's not a man of perfect faith, but he is a faithful man. I want you to understand that as we look into this mirror of Abraham, God is not calling you to a perfect faith. He's just calling you to faith. Right? It doesn't matter if your faith is this big or this big or this big. And what does the Bible say? The faith of a mustard seed will move a mountain. And the fact is that faith doesn't make us perfect. Faith is trusting the one who is perfect. And so we need to understand with Abraham that we're not going to be perfect people, right? That we're going to live messy lives. And as we interact with one another, we're going to interact with people who have messy situations. And we're to be a blessing in those. But also know this, God is still working in Abraham's life here. Abraham makes a mess of this. I don't know how you can excuse it in any way that he would do this again, saying Sarai is not his wife, but his sister, and giving her away. Here at this moment, we recognize that she's pregnant with the promised child, because in 21, she's going to give birth. And yet, Abraham just lacks faith in God. But God does work in mighty ways. The other thing that stands out in this section to me is Abimelech. Abraham, though he's the picture of faithfulness, doesn't seem very faithful, but Abimelech seems like a pretty faithful guy. Notice just a few things it says. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. Now Abimelech had not approached her. So he said, Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? Abimelech had no intention of sinning here, and yet he found himself in this situation. But notice this, God is working even in Abimelech's life to keep him from sinning. I look back upon my own life, and I recognize there is a lot of foolish things that I did not do that I could have easily done. There's a lot of bad mistakes that it would have only taken a moment, and I would have had a different outcome. Sometimes we want to take credit for all that. But I am convinced of this as we see Scripture. God works in messy people's lives. And yes, we make mistakes, but I believe God keeps us from making many more mistakes than we would have. God keeps us and protects us from sins that we would otherwise do on our own. I'm convinced of that. I think you see that with Abimelech. I think you see that with any teenage boy. I think you see that with any person, that we are prone to sin. We're prone to mistakes, that it only takes moments to do something stupid and ruin your life. And yet we need God's grace and his mercy to restrain us so that we might still walk in righteousness. And God's faithful to do that. Now notice here, Abimelech has been rebuked by God, and Abimelech is not exactly pleased by this. Verse 8. So Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all these things. And the men were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you that you have brought on me, my kingdom, a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done." And Abimelech said to Abraham, What did you see that you did this thing?" Notice what Abraham says. Abraham said, "I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife." As we reflect upon that statement there, why did Abraham do this? Why would he do this? He did it because he looked at this country that he's in, and he says, they don't believe God. They don't respect God. They don't trust God. They don't know the things of God. They don't care anything about him. And therefore, I don't trust them. Let me ask you, do you ever find yourself in that place? Where we look around the world and we say, the world doesn't care anything for God. The world doesn't care anything about these things. I do. I think we all find ourselves in that place. But I will tell you, if we find ourselves in that place, it becomes a sinful place. Notice what Abraham says. You don't fear God. And the question for Abraham has to be, well, do you fear God, Abraham? And the answer is no. Abraham fears Abimelech, but he does not fear God. Here's the reality. If Abraham had trusted God as his protector, he would not be concerned with Abimelech. But because he was so concerned with Abimelech, he did not fear God. As we think about our lives, as we think about our nation, as we think about our culture, we need to ask the question, do we fear man or do we fear God? Are we moving forward as people who trust God and are concerned with God? Are we moving forward as people who are afraid of the nations? Right? We can't be both hopeful in God and afraid of others. Right? We either fear God or we fear man. Here's the reality. If I got into a fight today, I would want the biggest guy behind me I could get. Right? I would want somebody who could protect me. I wouldn't want somebody squatting. And as I think about that, I only say that to say this. When we think about our fight with the world, we have God on our side. And if God is for us, who can be against us? If Satan wants to attack us, he can destroy me, but he can't destroy the one behind me. He can't destroy God. And so the question we find here is, are we going to be like Abraham and fear the things of this world more than trust the things of God? We ought to be a people that fear God more. Now also just notice with that fear and that lack of trust leads to what? It leads to sin. Right? His fear and lack of trust doesn't lead to a good consequence. Instead, it leads to him making poor decisions. When we fail to trust God, we will begin to steer away from God's path. But if we trust God, what will we do? We'll do what he says. We'll be obedient to him, and we'll prosper. Continue on, verse 14. Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants and gave them to Abraham, and returned Sarai, his wife, to him. And Abimelech said, Behold, my land is before you. Dwell where it pleases you. To Sarah he said, Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. I think Abimelech's being a little sarcastic here, isn't he? I've given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are vindicated. And so Abimelech didn't commit this great sin against Sarai. And notice what happens in verse 17. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, and also healed his wife and female slaves, so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. There's a few things to notice there. The one that's very obvious here is that sin always leads to negative consequence, right? If we do what is wrong, it's not ever going to lead to a positive result, right? We want to do some sort of math in our minds that if we do this thing wrong this way, it's going to lead to some sort of positive outcome. But that's never the case. Sin never leads to positive outcomes. You may be able to warp it in your mind for a time that it will, but it doesn't. It leads to destruction. But also here, notice just the promise. Those who will bless you will be blessed, and those who curse you will be cursed. And this is exactly what takes place with Abimelech. Abimelech, not knowingly, is a curse to Abraham when he takes Sarai to be his wife. Sarah is not to be his wife, but he takes her, and he's cursed, and his nation is cursed. But when he begins to bless Abraham, and he gives Sarah back, and he vindicates, then the wombs of the women in Abimelech's kingdom are open, that there is prosperity and that there is blessing. There is blessing with those who follow the Lord and who are blessed, blessing to those who bless Israel. Now let me just kind of lay this out in a longer sort of idea. Ultimately, who is the fulfillment of the Abraham covenant? That fulfillment is Jesus Christ. And so as people are blessing Abraham, they are blessed. As those who curse Abraham, they are cursed. But who is that actually pointing to ultimately? It's simply this. Those who bless Jesus will be blessed, but those who curse Jesus will be cursed. The reality is, in this life, there is no more important question than this. What is your relationship with Jesus Christ? Are you blessed by Jesus, or are you cursed by Jesus? Jesus clearly says in John, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. As we examine philosophy, as we examine religion, as we examine pop culture, we live in a time that wants to be, let's get along. You believe what you believe, I believe what I believe. As long as you're happy with what you believe, I'm happy with what I believe. But we don't live in a time that says there is truth. But we as a people, we have to say there is truth. And the truth is this: it's Jesus Christ. He is the way, truth, and life. There is no other way to salvation except apart from him. What happens in this place matters so much because there's no other way. The gospel is the only way that people can ever find hope. There will be people that will die this week who do not know Jesus. There will be people who will die this week who do know Jesus. And the question all comes to this, even right here: what is our relationship with this ultimate covenant bearer? What is our relationship with Jesus? Do you belong to him, or are you against him? Most of the world wants to be neutral with Jesus. You heard the song, A Friend of Jesus, right? And we want to be friends with Jesus. The world kind of wants to act that way. We can be just friends with Jesus. There's some neutral sort of idea here. Jesus is a good teacher. I don't have to believe everything he says. Jesus is a good prophet, but some of his stuff is No, it's either he's the way, truth, or life, or he's a fool. The reality is, it's a black and white sort of question. It's a yes or no sort of question. It's a binary question. What is your relationship with this Jesus? As we see chapter 20, we see Abraham, who is full of messiness. But in chapter 21, we see God turning this messiness into blessing. And so we're going to read Genesis 21, beginning verse 1. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Now, did Abraham and Sarah deserve such a great promise? I want you to understand, based upon their life, no, they seemed like they failed a little bit too many times. And yet God was still faithful to give them this great gift. And so here you have the son, the promised son, born to Sarah at 100 years old, named Isaac. Now, as you've seen here and as you already know, Isaac means laughter. As I think about laughter, I've reflected back some of the best times you have with family. My favorite holiday has always been Thanksgiving. Christmas is great, but Thanksgiving when I was a kid was the time in which all our family got together. And there was food and there was a good time. But you know what was always taking place in that house? Laughter. Right? There was always laughter. Anyone who's happy or joyful will laugh. Isn't it good when friends are just having a good time and they can't help but what? Laugh. And Isaac, Sarah's been through all this pain, and Isaac brings this laughter, this joy into her life. What a blessing. for Sarah. What a blessing for Abraham that Isaac brings joy or laughter. And I would say this, the gospel does the same for us. Whatever misery you may be going through, whatever mess you may have made in your own life, I go back to Philippians. He who began a good work and you will see it to completion. It is God who can bring laughter in the midst of messy situations. It's God who can bring laughter for Abraham and Sarah, even though they've made a mess of things. And it's God who can bring laughter and joy into your life, even despite yourself. Right? God blesses us with joy and laughter and goodness here. For the sake of time, we won't finish this chapter, but I want you to also just notice with the rest of this chapter, things don't just become perfect. Isaac is born, this child of blessing is here, but Sarah, she sees Ishmael, she sees Hagar, she gets jealous, she tells Abraham, cast her out. And Abraham's stuck in a situation in which he's having to cast out his own son. And Abraham doesn't want to, but God says, go ahead and do it. And it seems like an odd and difficult situation. And I don't think it's an example to follow. I think it's descriptive, not prescriptive. It's not telling us to do this, but it is telling us something about this God that we serve. Abraham's made a mess here that he's tried to go and make a way besides God's way. He's tried to make a way with Ishmael. And now that God's way is happening, he still has the consequences of his own plan. And they're still there, and he still has to deal with them. And so he does, and he casts Ishmael out. But you'll notice there, as the boy and the woman are there and they're dying, God provides for them. And God restores them. And God brings about a wife for Ishmael. And Ishmael then becomes a great nation. And what we see here is, yes, we're going to make messes in our life. We may make really big messes like Abraham. But God is able to make really good things out of it. And God is still working in those things. And it's kind of this tension that we find in Genesis of consequence and blessing. Right? That there's genuine consequence for sin. But then there's genuine blessing and mercy and grace at the same time. Right? And maybe you see that in your own life. The Lord sometimes seems like he's cursing you, and that's a blessing to keep you from sin. But sometimes maybe you're getting away with things that you ought not to get away with. And yeah, that's a blessing from God at times. But there's this tension between responsibility and God's mercy and grace and blessing we find in Abraham's life here. And we have to live in that tension. And all we can say with this is that God is faithful, and we're to strive to be faithful. And that God remains faithful in all of this, and we ought to remain faithful as we continue on. And so as we come to a close, let me just kind of bring it this way. We're not to go on sinning so that the Lord's grace may abound. Instead, what are we to do when we find that our life's a little bit too messy? When we find issues in our life, we're not to ignore them, but what are we to do? We're to repent. And we're to move and work to restore those areas in our life. We're to move so that we might go on without sinning. 1 John writes this, I write these things to you so that you will not sin. And that should be our life, is that we're striving to live a life without sin. But at the same time, we trust a God that is able, but not only able, willing to bring about his grace and mercy in messy situations. So I don't know where you find yourself, but I do know this: the Christian life is a life of repentance. It's a life of saying, here I am, Lord. Help shape me and make me to be more like you. Lord, I'm not perfect. Lord, I make some pretty big mistakes like Abraham. I need your grace and mercy, but Lord, help me to walk in obedience.